Hi, I am Madeline James Wright, and today I am chatting with Conlanger and fellow YouTuber George Corley. We're going to be discussing the intersections between conlanging and writing, and a quick apology, I have a little bit of a cold or congestion or something. I have kids, so who knows? But before we get into it, George, did you want to do a quick intro of yourself and what you're doing on your channel?
Yeah, so my name is George Corley. My channel is called Conlangery, and you can find on there, there is the Conlangery podcast, which is a continuation of something I've been doing on audio for over a decade, and now we have video shows. I do interviews of conlangers. We have, and we're going to be going sort of back into more like linguistics related topics, conlanging process related topics. Um, and also on that channel, I do weekly live streams where every Saturday at 8 a.m. Central Time, I hop on and I am building languages for Dungeons and Dragons. So I have done my version of Draconic, and basically, as of this recording, almost completed all of the spell incantations. That part I did off camera, but on the stream right now we are working on Sylvan, which is going to be kind of a complex project because I've got dialects and coinization going on with that. But yeah, so if you want to tune in for that, that's also on the Conlangery channel, Tongues and Runes, every Friday. And then about every month, I also release a podcast episode, which, do we want to say, like, sometime around the time that this is posting, there's going to be an interview with Madeline where I talk to
Yeah.
her.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
so,
coordinate the posting and there'll be links down below and stuff, but check that out after you finish watching this one.
yeah,
And I'll post all of George's stuff down below too, so it'll all
yeah,
be
yeah,
down there
yeah.
so you can check it out.
But for now, I think you have some questions for me, right?
I do. It is my turn to ask the questions. um so while, and we talked about this a lot in your interview a little bit, but while I am mainly a writer who does some conlanging for my books, you're mainly a conlanger, but you've done some writing too. And I've been curious if your writing is sort of in service to your conlanging, or if you think about it as a whole separate hobby, or how those sort of come together for you.
I just have a few projects that I've worked on separately, and it's interesting because, like, to me, my primary art form has been conlang for a while, but I've like written like stories since I was in like eighth grade. I just never published anything, and not always had conlangs involved. One I have a like a like a novella written that I have kind of like set aside because I have a bunch of placeholder names and I want to develop a bunch of conlangs for that. Um, but it's kind of been, I have a lot of stuff going on in my life, with trying to do a YouTube channel and have a full-time job, and I have three kids. So I just, it's sort of interesting. So I would say like the primary creative thing that I focus on is conlanging actually. Um,
Mhm.
and so that's where I'm living at. So I'm a very, as we said in that episode, I'm like a very different sort of animal from you because I like to do the conlanging and I just make a whole language, and you are like making just enough of a language to serve the purposes you need for a story.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a very different approach, but it's definitely very cool.
Yeah.
And I mean, both in a way are different modes of storytelling and, portraying information and building out,
Yes.
a story and everything anyway. So they have a lot in common with each other.
Yes. I I definitely do like something that is interesting that I do when I'm doing conlanging. I use a historical method, and I do often have like my words telling a story through their etymology and through their
Mhm.
through the way that they're constructed. So
Mhm.
I don't know if we want to get into that, or you have some questions, because my understanding was you were bringing me on and you were going to talk about some things that you have issues that you wanted to bring a more experienced conlanger to ask about.
Mhm. Yeah, I have some questions along those lines. But we'll see what we get into.
Let's see.
Okay. So my first question is going to kind of tie into one of the core, I guess you could call it like a philosophy that I see a lot of fantasy writers talk about when it comes to fantasy language. And I'm very curious about your thoughts on this as a conlanger specifically, because this is something that's like more from the writer perspective and not the conlanger perspective. But a common way to think about language in fantasy books is to assume that everything was in a different fantastical language originally and then has been translated into English or whatever language you're reading the book in. So most things that have direct English or whatever real world language translations would be in English, right? Like you'll translate horse as horse kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but everything else, like names of things and stuff like that, would be in the other language. And I normally see this in books very limited to like, people's names or place names, those very strict sort of categories, which I think is sort of a limitation of non-conlangers' understanding of, I guess, conlanging and linguistics in general. But what other kinds of things would you think would potentially not be translated other than people's names? Because I know you have familiarity with a lot of like real world languages too and translations and stuff. Like I've seen like with the relay and everything like that too. So I feel like you would have a lot of ideas.
So that's an interesting question. So what you're talking about is the translation convention, the idea
Yeah.
that like everything in this novel, and this is an old trope. I mean, even Tolkien used this trope, and he even translated names, right? He
Okay.
the like Bilbo and Frodo, those are not actually their names in Westeron. That's
Oh.
yes, no, yeah. So Bilbo in it, so he actually had some work on like what the common tongue that humans and hobbits speak in Middle Earth was,
Mm-hmm.
and Bilbo, his actual name is Bilba, and Frodo is actually Maura. I think there's Bilba and Maura Labingi that he translated into Bilbo and Frodo Baggins.
My mind is blown. What?
No, but that's an interesting thing. So sometimes people actually do translate names themselves, and
Oh.
but I think it does add to the world to have at least have the names be in a different language. Um, the As much as I would like there to be lots of books that are just entirely in a conlang, I understand that the needs of telling a story to people who are not willing to learn a whole language for it sort of necessitate not doing that. But
Limits
um,
the readership a little bit.
yeah, I think at least having names is useful. There Another thing that you can do without getting too far out from readers is thinking about idioms.
Okay.
So you could probably insert an idiom that is not so far away from the English idiom that, or maybe not so, but that is like transparent enough that people can understand in context what it means, right?
Mm.
Um, you know, idioms and common like conceptual metaphors. You could probably do some translation in order to like get a feel of how this culture talks.
Mm.
Like I remember listening to Artifexian's podcast, and his um, his co-host Bill is making this culture, and Bill is not a conlanger. Actually, Edgar is like making a conlang for him, right?
Yeah.
But there was a thing about, I think that they have, if I remember correctly, they have like airships in that world, and because of that, Bill, even not being conlanger, like added a lot of metaphors for that that usually would relate to the sea in English to the air, if I'm
Yeah.
remembering correctly. And then
I think I remember what you're talking about. I think I've seen
yeah,
part of
yeah.
that.
So you can do things like that if there's something that's important to the economy or to transportation or something like that. You can sort of introduce certain like metaphors or certain ways of referring to things. Um,
Hmm.
like, you can think about things like in Chinese, the word for one of the the word for to eat is 吃饭. 吃 means food. 饭 means rice, because there's a lot of rice cultivation, mainly in southern China, right?
Hmm.
Um, so you can think about like, how does the way that they live, the way that they eat, how their economy works, how their political structure works, all of that, how that affects their metaphors.
Hmm.
Um, and also, you could tell stories of the past, because like English has tons of agricultural metaphors
Hmm.
that are not as relevant in modern American society, but still sort of are 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 alive, right?
Hmm.
So that's another thing you could do. Um, One thing that I have seen once or twice is like, but it, I have seen in some sci-fi stuff, playing with this, is like, consider pronouns,
Hmm.
because um, so English has gendered pronouns, he, she, and
Hmm.
it, right?
Hmm.
And of course, like in and also we have they, which can be used as a singular to refer to someone of unknown or indefinite or actually neutral gender
Hmm.
nowadays. And we have um, and that has also generated a lot of discourse, due to the adjustments made for people's identities. Now, many languages do not have gendered pronouns at all. So the question is, you can decide for yourself whether the language you're translating from has gender pronouns, right?
Hmm.
Um, and based on that, you can consider how that would affect storylines, right? Because if they don't have gendered pronouns, then a lot of times overhearing something, they will not actually get the gender information from the pronoun.
Hmm.
So, like, you could probably do this very subtly just by using singular they a lot more
Hmm.
than normal. I think that's become normalized enough that that readers will pass over it
Hmm.
without doing it. There's a podcast called Epiphany by Kay Boehm, where um, she actually coined a separate, um, gender neutral pronoun. Used a neopronoun, and just
Hmm.
uses that throughout.
Yeah.
Um, that's a little that is something you can do. It's maybe a little bit more like noticeable to the reader that that's what you're doing, which maybe
Yeah.
you want, maybe you don't, right? But there, if you can think about whether that's a good like salient distinction that you could do entirely in English prose,
Mm,
but being sure that you're reflecting something about the other language.
right.
Um, and you could do that with a lot of different grammatical distinctions as well, and a lot of things about like um, words, right?
Mm,
Uh, Words that maybe there's two distinct words in English, but the target language you're talking about is um, it has them as the same word.
mm,
That might be a little bit difficult. The so like the pronouns could be easy to implement. Things like lexical differences might be might be a little bit difficult to do in the main language of your characters,
mm,
because
mm-hmm.
you are still writing this in English and you got to somehow convey it. It might be easier if like you're highlighting some of those differences that occur in other languages that they're hearing, kind of
Mm-hmm.
like in Chinese the word yang means both goat and sheep. So if you had a word that means both goat and sheep in a language that the characters speak but is not their main language, they could cause confusion, stuff like that. So
Mm-hmm.
there are a few things that, while still using the translation convention, you could incorporate in order to highlight the idea of people are speaking different languages. This is not everybody actually speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually something different.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's a general guideline, I would say, is like try to make some decisions about the language and then see if you can adjust the English prose in order to reflect what is actually being said in the world.
Right. Do you think that that's something that could be done with like thinking about like dialogue specifically with like word order or like like how you translate compound words and stuff like that? Like, or do you think that would be like too weird?
Um, I don't know. It depends. I mean, I make up whole languages, so it's it's fine with me.
So
I
it's not too
think
weird.
that there are also things like you could decide that there's a different word order, and then um think about if you watch movies with subtitles in two different languages you understand, you often run into this problem where the dialogue was timed specifically to reveal this particular word at the end, but
Yeah.
it's actually very difficult in the other language that you're subtitling to actually get that word to the end.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like different strategies of either to just leave it and they split the sentence wherever they want to, or
Mm-hmm.
they like do some contrived alternate construction in order to get that key word to the end in order to reveal the information appropriately, right? So you can
Yeah.
think about things like that and think about that sort of stuff. I don't know if that is going to be as salient to readers
Yeah, that's
as
fair.
uh, or as like or go or that readers will get that as much as like, oh, I am showing that you don't get gender information by using singular they a lot, stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. Um,
Yeah, those are more like discrete kind of.
yeah, it's uh, also you have to consider that you have very limited information in dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not really a large corpus to figure out what syntactic structures are being represented.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think things like idioms and playing around with pronouns are probably more easier to like convey to the audience in that regard.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I oddly most of the TV I watch is actually either in Mandarin or in Korean. I don't speak either language, but I've watched enough hundreds of hours of TV of it that some words I sort of recognize, and like I
Yeah.
try to pay attention to the subtitles to like try and gain more familiarity with it, but just with the ordering of like where the English words are with even just the words I do recognize, and I'm like, that's like at the end of the sentence instead of over here, and
Yeah.
I don't think I could ever learn from subtitles.
I used to watch historical dramas with my wife. My wife is
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, and I speak
Mm-hmm.
Chinese a little bit. And there is a lot that cannot be conveyed in the subtitles, especially for the historical dramas, because like
Yeah, which
they
is
have a ton of pronouns that signify social status in those
mm-hmm.
things,
Mm-hmm.
particularly ones that focus on the imperial court. And
Yes.
it's like, okay, there is a first person pronoun that can only be used by the emperor. How are you going to
Mm-hmm.
convey that in English? Well, you can use the royal we, but it still doesn't really have the same impact.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you a lot of times in these dramas, the actor will even emphasize Jun, right? This pronoun
Mm-hmm.
that only the emperor will use, because it's like such a weird thing. I don't know if they're not used to saying it or they're actually emphasizing it to say like my character is the emperor, right?
Mm-hmm. So fancy.
And like if you're going to convey something like that in a book, you're probably just going to have to do exposition, because like just
Yeah.
inserting a new pronoun into sentences is going to be super super weird.
Mm-hmm.
And people may not get it unless like you have like a one sentence exposition in it. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really tough. Although that does make me feel a lot less bad because almost exclusively what I watch is the historical ones, like the historical C dramas
Yeah.
and K dramas, like
There's
some
there's
Joseon
there's a
era,
lot
you
of
know.
other things. Some things are like culturally translated in weird ways. I remember in one there was like one of the servant girls like dropped something or something, and in English it was translated like "excuse me" or "I'm sorry" or something. In Chinese, what she said was "nu bigaisu," which means "slave girl should die." Which, I mean, here's the thing: like they translated that from Chinese to like lessen the impact because it's like in the imperial court that's like not, and it conveys something about values, but it also is not like a weird thing to say in that particular context, right?
Right. Yeah.
But if you're doing this in a fantasy world, you may want to enhance that and actually have that kind of phrase in English for your audience to say, oh, this culture has different values from my culture, and that's expressed in the language they use, right? Another one is in the movie Hero. Have you seen the movie Hero?
No, I've not.
I think it's called Hero. There's an arc word that people are writing in calligraphy all the time that keeps getting translated in the subtitles as "our land." And there's a lot of it is it's about, and it's referring to China. The word itself is actually "tianxia," which means under heaven, which is an old name for China. And I'm not sure exactly why they chose that. I feel like maybe they were trying to appeal more to like English speakers. Chinese speakers will understand what that is, and it refers to China, and it also refers to the same sort of thing of concept as like the more modern term "zhongguo" does, middle country, right? Where it's kind of considering China as everything, as the pinnacle of civilization, the center of the world, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. If you speak another language and you're watching like subtitles, look at what changes and think about why that changed, right?
Yeah.
and you can get a flavor for like what things could you maybe not change in order to tell a story about how the people see themselves or how the people interact with the world, what their values are, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's a good idea. And I think that even just as a watcher, the some of the dramas I've watched that they keep more of those. I always find like it feels saying more immersive is not correct, but like it just feels like you can understand what's going on a
Yeah.
little bit better, whereas like sometimes it just feels like when they translate it into something super Englishy, it feels a little bit more like shallower, like you're not quite understanding what's going on quite as well. But
Yeah.
then of course, like the thing you said about the like I deserve to die thing, I think my husband picks up on language a lot quicker than I do. Like I just don't. And when I was watching that, he was not watching it with me, but they said it enough times that he learned that just walking past and forth and like glancing at the screen that he would just randomly say that to me when like it,
Yeah.
it's like a thing.
You could end up picking up weird things. But yeah, there's tons of examples like that, and
Mhm.
there's things of like when they're doing subtitles, they're trying to like get the same story to the audience as much as possible
Mhm.
without like being like too weird. So that's an understandable thing. And
Yeah.
there's definitely some ones that probably are not ever translated quite 100% just because it's really hard. Like
Yeah.
stuff like sugar, sugar, shidia. Those are combination of shi meaning master and a sibling term like older brother,
Mhm.
older sister, younger brother, younger sister, and it's someone who had the same master as you, and then indexed by gender and age, right?
Right.
Which these are normal words in Chinese. My wife
Mhm.
has a person that she always addresses as shijie, like master and then older sister.
Mhm.
But it's if you're doing subtitles, it's going to be really hard to you either have to like coin a new compound of like master sister and then the audience is like what does that mean, or you're just going to have to do the best you can and say like okay, we'll just translate it as brother and sister or something like that, right? um
Yeah. I think I see like first brother and like second sister. I see those translated into English, but that tends to be a lot of the ones
yeah,
I see.
that's a little easier to understand.
Mhm.
And if you do something like that, that might be a place where, like, say you've built a naming language,
Mhm.
you have you have the capacity to make some words. Maybe something like that that will be difficult to translate in English in an understandable way could be something where, like, this title, you make a word for it,
Mhm.
and it has an etymology and everything, and like you explain it once, and then your readers understand that this title
Right.
means this thing, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's different strategies for different things. Sometimes you can play with just the English and get things across. Sometimes you need a little exposition. Sometimes you might need to actually put a conlang word in there.
Mhm. So, branching off of that actually. So, what about things that so cuz part of my goal right now, right, is that like I want to learn more conlanging. I want to understand it better. I want to build up my repertoire of like types of conlanging things that I can do even though like it doesn't make sense for me to do like a single full conlang. So like what are other things that you think would make sense in a translation to not be translated sort of like that? So like there's names could not be translated. I know there's like titles is something that you see frequently not translated, but are there other like smaller things that you can think of that would not be translated?
Uh it will depend on what you want. So here's so titles, names, things, uh, cultural concepts that don't really translate
Mhm.
that well. Like in The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, there is a
Okay.
concept, I believe it's called Shifgrathor, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a borderline thing, because it is a little exoticizing to do this, but it is a word for like social, like politeness, conventions and such, that this world has. And I think she's using that particular word in order to highlight that this is different from what the reader is used to in terms of how people manage politeness and social hierarchies, social relationships, right?
Yeah.
And so that can be something, and that is something that people actually do in the real world. Like, I I apologize for talking about Chinese so much, but it's the language that
No, you're fine. It's actually one of the
I
easiest
know
ones
the
for you to
most.
reference because I hear it a lot.
Yeah, but like you will hear people talk. I think it's actually overused a little bit. People will talk about guanxi, 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 and the Chinese word guanxi. If you actually like look at how it's used, it just translates as relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, people borrow that word to talk specifically about Chinese practices of managing like gift giving and maintaining social connections that are a little bit different from Western values, right? So that can be a thing that you could do, is like cultural concepts that don't translate. Another thing that can be good for this is like mythological creatures in your cultures, because mythological creatures, because they're made up, they don't translate.
Right.
And like that's another thing. Like I see a lot of like different, like there's a lot of conventions around translating those words. Like there's people do sometimes translate them, but it's always kind of off. Like, okay, you translate this Chinese word as demon. Are they demons? Kind of.
Yeah.
People talk about long being translated as a dragon. That kind of works because our word dragon has taken on this meaning of this very, very broad meaning of broadly a large sort of serpentine reptilian creature that can be a lot of different things, right?
Yeah.
But there are people who object to that because they say the long is its own thing and it's not related to Western dragons, really. The one that irks me is like people translate Fenghuang as phoenix. Fenghuang is just a bird. It's just a bird that represents like femininity and love and marriage and things like that. It's not literally on fire.
Yeah.
But they've started to become conflated. I watched the live action Mulan movie and it's like, okay, well, they're translating it as phoenix, and then he talks about it burning, and I'm like burning to ash, and I'm like, I start looking up and I'm like, okay, if it's a Chinese like writer doing this, and I'm like, that's okay. But then I look at the writers, they're all white people.
Yeah. I struggled with Mulan. I don't like the new one.
Bring it back, like cultural concepts, religious concepts, mythological beings could be other things that you might want to coin a word for in order to like highlight the differences, and also like signal to the reader that this is a different thing. Like this is not a demon, this is not a dragon, this is not a creature you're familiar with. So like pay attention, listen to my description so that you actually know what this thing is actually, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that gives you. It also ties very neatly into then you're using your, I guess, like readers, how much mental brain with brains, whatever. I'm sick, you know what I mean. But how much of that they have towards understanding and picking up all these concepts, if they are culturally and societally significant, then they're very meaningful already, and it's an easy
Yeah,
thing to
yeah,
bring in than just something that doesn't actually have as much like relevance or meaning or like narrative weight to it or something.
yeah.
So I
And
like that.
there's also a case for like I think it also depends on what you're going for. Because like
Mm.
I say like this can signal this is a different thing. You may also
Mm-hmm.
want to use something that tends to be a more general thing and then specifically define your version of it in order to like demon can just mean like spirits that exist in the world, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you could actually use the word demon to get the reader's attention and have certain expectations and then break them.
Mm-hmm.
But it's we're talking about conlanging stuff. Like it is also a thing of like if you have spirits that are not really like what we expect when we see the word demon, then you
Mm-hmm.
could you could use a conlang word for that. Um, there's there's all kinds of things where you could do that. Now you are coining a language. You are making a language specifically for spellcasting.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
useful because it's highlighting that this is a different language. This is what it sounds like to cast a spell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it can also be useful for. It can also be useful to have at least enough to make full sentences in a language that your characters don't understand or
Right.
that is foreign to them, in order to signal the foreignness.
Mm-hmm.
It's uh, so that is another aspect where you could go and get a little bit more significant conlanging. Uh, it may be now. There's discourse on this. You don't have to do like historical conlanging. However,
Mm-hmm.
it can be useful to have an idea of how sound changes work and maybe do a little bit of it if you want to
Okay.
convey that certain names are more ancient than others, right?
Mm. Okay.
Even in a naming language. Or certain words are older, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. Um, because you can go and say like this is borrowed from an earlier stage of the language. It has this phonological structure that is not present in the modern language, but is still somewhat compatible, right?
Right.
Just like we have a lot of Latin words in English, they have been very heavily anglicized.
Mm-hmm.
However, they follow different phonological patterns than native Germanic words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can recognize them pretty
Mm-hmm.
easily that this is a Romance loan, usually.
Yeah.
Um,
Ye-
that's so things that are loan words from earlier languages or from foreign languages, you can
Mm-hmm.
you can be considering that. Um, on the subject of naming languages,
Mm-hmm.
um, specifically, and so you can have a naming language. You can do it just for names. You can also coin specific words for different things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that it's important to make some decisions about the language. Not you don't have to like fill out a whole grammar about all of this stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
make some decisions about um, things that would directly affect names. For
Okay.
example, Russian names inflect for case and gender.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means now to an English speaking observer, that means that there will be certain endings. It also means that, so Russian surnames, particularly inflect for gender, so you have the difference between off and ova
Mm-hmm.
in Russian names. You can consider whether your language has that like gendered separation and if it affects names, because it doesn't always. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
if your language is going to have a case system, and you don't have to decide what the case system is, whether it's it's accusative or ergative or whatever. But if you're going to say this language does have cases, then you can say, okay, what is the default case, and does it have an ending? What is the case form that we would borrow? Maybe it wouldn't have anything. Things like basic adpositions or a genitive case can be useful, because sometimes you have a patronymic and you have like an of somebody, right, or son of
Mm-hmm.
somebody, right, like the O or Mac in Irish and Scottish names.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can and then another thing is that you can have what's say another thing is like compounding rules,
Mm.
like okay, a language that has patronyms and matronyms, Icelandic.
Yeah.
So my name is George Corley. That's with English surnames. If I use Icelandic, the Icelandic mode, I would be George Hopert's son,
Mm-hmm.
because that's my dad's name plus the son ending. Actually, there's a genitive in there, but you'd have to. That's because it's an S and son says. But if you hear, let me look up. So Bjork. If I look up so Björk, the Icelandic musician, is Björk Guðmundsdóttir. So that's is it father or mother is Guzmund? It looks like a man's name, but Guzmund, the genitive S, and then Dottir, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can think about that. That also will get you thinking about like how do names actually work, and not just
Right.
copying a given name's surname. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot of things to consider about that, because some languages use surnames, so that are, and they can come before or after the given name. Some languages use patronyms or matronyms. Some languages you just have one name,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just that. And then names can be, we're used to mostly opaque names, like George.
Mm-hmm.
If you trace it back, it in Greek, Georgios meant like farmer. It's
Mm-hmm.
like earth worker, but nobody cares about that in the modern day. I'm just named
Yeah.
after one of my great grandfathers that doesn't have anything to do with farming, right?
Yeah.
We have a few that are transparent, like charity or temperance or things like that. In some
Mm-hmm.
other languages, like in Chinese, in a lot of Native American languages, names are more transparent.
Yeah.
And they're not just historical. And then there's names that are transparent in one context and not in another. Like I think a lot of Arabic names are kind of transparent in Arabic, but when they're used by people by other languages, lots of Muslim cultures do not speak Arabic outside
Mm-hmm.
of like learning the Quran. Then those become opaque because it's like historical, and there's a lot of names that get reused all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Most common given name in the world is Muhammad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's those kinds of things can be relevant of like, okay, you can consider a little bit how this name is constructed and what it means. But, you're going to be mostly limiting yourself to structures that affect nouns, maybe a few things that would derive nouns from other classes, right? And then, so you don't need a full conlang still. One thing, so I want to say one thing, because when you said you wanted to talk to me about this, one thing that came into my mind is, if you are doing the thing that you're doing and saying, I'm going to do just enough for my story, there's a concept in prop making called a hero prop.
Okay.
So like, especially if you're using actual like physical models, right? Like the old Star Trek series, they would have a version of the Enterprise that is like hugely detailed, very, very like very well detailed, so they could do close-up shots and get all the greebles in and actually like have it look realistic. And then they had much simpler models of the Enterprise or another ship or a bird of prey that is not so detailed. I think that kind of thing can work with conlanging, both with languages and with words. Not all of your words are going to have an interesting etymology anyway. Some of them haven't changed for 5,000 years and they're just like there. But I think you want to think more carefully about things that are more important, like your main character's name or a particular cultural concept that you want to use the word for often and things like that. So that you have that in your back pocket if you want to pull out like stuff about the origin of it or stuff in the text if it becomes story relevant.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So there are things like a lot of the things I'm talking about, like maybe you don't necessarily need to do it a lot for like a one-off character from a different culture that you never see again.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just make up a thing, right? Unless it's like related. Maybe if it's a related language, you could do a little bit of historical work to say, okay, like so this looks kind of like words from this language, but not quite, stuff like that. Or maybe if it's just like unrelated, you can just be like, oh, we'll just make up something that doesn't sound like this other language, right?
Yeah.
But then things that you want to come back to over and over, you think more about like, what are the sounds of this language? What kind of structures underlie it? Again, as much as you need to in order to get that stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That actually ties into, and you might actually know what this actually is, but something I've come across, and I think it's mostly in the like Joseon era historical K-dramas. Something that I've sort of picked up on, which could just be for storytelling purposes. It could not. I don't know, but it seems like a lot of the names of things, especially like places and buildings and stuff like that, is all like Chinese characters that, or like it's a different language than they speak. Like their naming language is a different language almost, and then they bring it up a lot and talk about it a lot. Like, oh, what do those characters mean? Your name means this and this, and so it brings up that idea of like they're not all 1000% fluent in it, so they talk about what they mean all the time, which is, it's really helpful for obviously like me who doesn't know what any of it is anyway, but like it could something like that be interesting too, like where it is a different language.
Yeah, so let's talk about that specific instance. So Korea was heavily influenced by Chinese culture. I think at different times they have been like a tributary of dynastic of different Chinese dynasties, things like that.
Yeah.
And they initially learned writing from the Chinese, then they developed their own alphabet. Yes, I say alphabet because it is actually an alphabet. Hangul is an alphabet. but they still choose personal names based on Chinese characters, and they take a Korean reading of the Chinese character. You can basically in fact, basically any Korean name, you can figure out what characters they are, and then Chinese people just pronounce those characters in Chinese. So, like Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un is Jin Jong Un in Chinese, because that's Chinese characters. They just transliterate, and so that can be a thing that happens, and you can see elements of this all over the world, right? You have a lot of English speakers that have like Latin origin names, a lot of speakers of various different languages throughout South and Southeast Asia that have Arabic origins because their cultures are Muslim, right? So that is something that can convey, if you do it right, relationships between cultures, and say, okay, this is, so I think what you would want to do there is, like, these names, maybe they are transparent in the source language, and the source language has enough prestige that people kind of know about it. Like in the Korean example, they can look at the characters and they know what the characters mean. They're still educated in what they call Hanja, is Chinese characters as used in Korean. And so they know, they will know the meanings of their names, even though in Korean itself, that meaning is not, might not necessarily be so transparent. So you could have this sort of dichotomy, right?
Yeah.
So that can add an interesting layer to conveying social relationships, historical social relationships, because Korea is not so subordinate to China anymore, at least not South Korea. And so history, cultural relationships, and other things like that, by having an idea of like names that come from other languages. Definitely something to consider. It does mean that you essentially need to have some information on both languages, because you want to see, if you're actually printing the names in there, you want to talk about like the source language, what the name was there, and you want to, and then if you're going to have both that source language and this other language in the world, you want to have an idea of how that name got phonologically adapted to the target language that the characters actually speak to. So it requires a little bit more work than just having all names come out of the same language. However, it's such a common thing in the world for names to be loaned between languages that it can be very useful for relating history and social relationships.
It's really cool too. Like, I feel like once I get through my current set of, I mean, I don't know if you could, I feel like my spell language is more than a naming language, but it's definitely not a full conlang. It's like a mini conlang. I don't know. But I feel like my next project, I'm going to have to include some sort of like multicultural, multinational like intrigue where there's people that speak different languages, because I feel like that'll be a really good way for me to use more, more conlanging and differences between languages and stuff.
Yeah. And there's always, I think there's a sliding scale you can apply. Probably like multidimensional, because there's also a sliding scale of like how much historicity do you want to involve, how much like morphology and such. But like from what I have heard, I have not followed all of your streams. It seems like the spell language is relatively complete because you've had to do more complex like constituents within the spell formula,
Yeah.
right? Um,
It's I was thinking about it because I know you had mentioned the conlanging relays, and I was like, do I actually have like enough language to do something like that? And I was sitting through and I was just like, I don't have any concept of like adjectives. Like I have no adjectives whatsoever. Those don't exist in mine so far, which is kind of a
I mean,
problem.
some languages don't have adjectives, so
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe
I'm like
maybe your properties are just expressed through verbs.
it might be. That's true.
But I
It's
mean, what you're saying, I think what interpreting what that, I mean, that's just a conlanger thing I'm saying. But I think from what you're saying, I think what you mean is like you haven't made decisions on how what we convey with adjectives will be conveyed, right? You
correct.
haven't figured out how to modify a noun with a word yet. So,
Yeah, yeah. So
well, I
there's
mean,
been hmm?
there is always the by the seat of your pants, figure it out as you go along method. Um, the
Yeah.
and conlangers are always kind of doing that anyway because we run into a translation that I'm like, I never actually figured out how to do a temporal subordinate clause. I need
Mhm.
to figure that out now. So
Yeah.
it's like I try to get as much background as I can before that so that I'm not just like suddenly jumping into something. But there's always things that you miss. You're always going to have to coin a few words
Mhm. Mhm.
until you get like into insane things like you know. I don't know if you're going to ever be like Jim Hopkins with 12,000 words in his language, right?
No, I I
Um,
I doubt it. I would if I was ever gonna do something like that, I'd probably have to look up like the lists of things because like even just like I don't have any number like I haven't thought about numbers. Like there's the
oh,
concept of
okay.
like few many. Like I don't even think my language would have numbers. I think it's just one few many. And then there's like
Some languages are like
tenses
that.
because like alls I have is like do this thing. There might be like a conditional future thing, but like other than that, there's like no tenses. There's not like I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that like
And you here's the thing: you got to decide whether you actually have tense in the first place. Not all languages do it.
mm,
Everything that this is an interesting uh, topic of conversation because you're like, because like I know what you mean is that you haven't decided how to handle this thing, but
yeah,
also everything you're mentioning is like, well, maybe the language doesn't have it.
yeah,
Like maybe
yeah.
your
But
language
I
doesn't
don't
have
even know.
numbers, like you said yourself, because
Mm,
not all languages have numerals, right?
mm,
Maybe your language doesn't have tense, but maybe it does, and maybe you need to figure out that system. It's
right.
it's that's I like numeral systems, so I always will go and make them, but
Mm,
you know, is not necessarily every culture will have them depending on what their material culture is and their technology and like what they need socially, right?
yeah,
um
that makes sense.
yeah, so it kind of um not to be like environmental determinist about this, but like language does sort of adapt to the cultural conditions it's in.
Hmm.
So there are plenty of cultures that like did not have numerals and then borrowed an entire numeral system from another language, or they had their own native numerals and they still borrowed an entire numeral system from another language. Um,
Right.
but there's lots of different ways of handling that, and um, there there are interesting ways you could play with that with your spell language because this is for like some kind of fairy creature, right? That actually
There are
listens to
like
the spells
spirits
and
that exist in the magical plane, so like they don't have a
yeah.
material culture at all. They just like exist. you
Yeah.
know?
So you can, if you ever want to develop it further, you can get into very interesting alien mindsets
Mhm.
when trying to figure out like how would they actually refer to things, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
um, but in the end, I think, doing as much conlanging as you want is useful. I do like to advocate for people to do the actual conlanging work
Mhm.
to the degree that they're going to do it rather than like appropriating somebody else's language for your fantasy beings or your
Yeah.
aliens,
Yeah.
because that, like, borrowing things can get problematic. Either it gets too obvious because readers know the language, or it's like kind of veering into appropriation because your readers don't know the language, but they're associating it with something other than the culture that actually produced it, right? Um,
Mhm.
and so I think I would say, like at the end of this, um, think about your story, think
Mhm.
about what things you want to convey, and the tools you have are naming language, develop to the degree that you feel is necessary for like what underlying decisions you're going to make about the language and how much
Mhm.
it's going to be used. And then individual words, um, idioms that you coin that would be like translated from the language, um, like sort of going up in order of complexity, as well as like different phrasing in English relating to how your language goes. Then you could
Mhm.
go into like limited, just what you need structures to build a few sentences or like spell incantations or what have you.
Yeah.
And then going into like fuller conlangs and like depending on how many words you need. Um, are you hearing stuff from
Your poor sad children. It's okay, that's
uh
very commonplace on my channel, just screaming children in the background, so you're good.
yeah, okay. That happens on streams once in a while. I'm like, I don't know what people are going to think about that. Anyway, but yeah, going up and then up to full conlangs, and even that, it's like a gradual scale of like,
Mhm.
how many do you need? Like 500 words? Do you need 1,000 words? Probably not going to need that many for a
Yeah.
book. There's also considering the media, like films are hiring conlangers more and more. The film actually needs to have the dialogue there in the
Mhm.
language.
I love
In
it
your
so much.
in your book, you can rely on translation convention a lot more and
Mhm.
just tell the reader they're speaking X-ish, whatever. Um, so that's another thing, right?
Mhm.
And then depending on your comfort level, you can decide, and comfort level and your budget, you can decide like how much of this am I going to do, and also could I go hire somebody who is like an actual conlanger to like
Right.
do something more fleshed out, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's all dependent on what you need and what you're comfortable with. But I think it's really great to see you as an author dipping
Mhm.
your toe into conlanging to the degree you want, and then we'll see what it develops from there. Maybe in your next one, you're gonna actually build a full conlang, and we'll
We'll
see.
see.
We'll
We'll see,
see.
I know more people now, I rely a lot on the conlangers in my streams, like, I found that like, world builders are always so
Yeah.
great and helpful, but, like, there's a level that, like, conlangers go to, like, the community is just so very, very, very
Yeah.
helpful.
Conlanging and world building go hand in hand because
Mhm.
language touches everything. So you need to know a
Mhm.
lot of things about the world in order to figure out the words.
Yeah.
So So like that, I kind of do minimal world building, but I have to do some.
Yeah.
Because I have to understand the things about how that inform how these beings think, how my
Mm-hmm.
speakers think, and how my speakers would refer to things.
Yeah.
Get in their heads a little bit. So I do need to know like things about the world around them and how they interact with it. So
Mm-hmm.
the conlangers are often also world builders to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's very cool. But I don't think I had any more questions.
Uh-huh.
I'm, I have all your links down below, and everyone
Yeah,
should go watch the other interviews, should go watch your
yeah. If
streams and your
if
channel.
you are interested in conlanging specifically, um, then and want to know more, then yeah, the monthly podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We have one coming up that's going to be a little bit more traditional, like conlangery from the audio days where we go over a linguistics topic. But I
Mm-hmm.
have been doing a lot of interviews also of like YouTubers that do conlanging stuff, and of course every Friday I do the tongues and runes, and you can see me building a language live and see how I do that and see
Yeah.
like the steps involved in it. And maybe you'll look at that and say maybe and say, okay, it's not as intimidated as you thought, and you want to try it. I'm here to promote that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, thank you for having me on, Madeline.
Yeah, of course. It was very helpful, and I'm sure I will randomly throw you a bunch of questions at some point and be like, "So, I've been thinking about this and I have this side question, but
Happy to be on. Yeah, happy to help you out in uh any way you want. But I right now I think I do need to go and deal with some children and take them out of the house so that their mother doesn't go
yes."
insane.
Very well. Thank you again, and I'll see everyone in the next video.